Welcome back to the PCC podcast. And today I have a very exciting guest who is an expert in multiple topics that I know are very, very relevant to our listeners and the women that want to learn more about their body composition, their metabolism. So let's welcome Dr. Grant Tinsley. And I'm super excited to be able to chat with you again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been too long, as we were saying offline. I'm happy to be speaking with you again today.
Yeah, sweet. Well, I know we're gonna get pretty into the nitty gritty of things, but I would love to just have you give like a quick introduction for like your background and like what got you into these different research focuses, and then we can kind of just get into the weeds.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. How far back do you want me to go on the
All the way
background?
back, do it.
All the way back. Okay. Well, I was born on August 1. No, I'm just kidding. Um, yeah, I mean, so honestly, my interest in science started as early as I can remember. I've always loved school, always loved science, and I didn't know, where that would take me, but I loved everything: chemistry, physics, biology, all of it. But when I was a teenager, I got interested in fitness and exercise and nutrition. I don't know if we'll ever hear this, but I always talk about a friend of mine from junior high who I haven't talked to since then, but who was unusually into fitness for someone who was, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old. He would do, I think, like 100 sit-ups every night and 100 push-ups,
Wow.
and had a really good physique at a time when it wasn't as popularized. And I just wasn't aware, but I was just amazed. I'm like, wow, the body can adapt like that. And it's what got me thinking about exercise beyond just, I play sports. So fast forwarding a few years, I was studying physiology at Oklahoma State University for my undergraduate degree, and later added a degree in nutrition as well there. And it was kind of a marriage of my love of science and my interest in the human body and lifting and how the human body can adapt. But I still wasn't really sure the exact area I wanted to go in. I could tell as studying the topics that were really interesting to me, and learning a lot, in the classroom as well as in the gym. I did a master's program after I finished there in biomedical sciences, and this focused a lot on physiology. We did a lot of cadaver dissection, which gave me a really renewed appreciation for the human body. But still, I was not quite sure what I wanted to do. So after that, I realized I really wanted to formally study exercise, because I had studied, the human body mostly through physiology and anatomy and nutrition, but I wanted some formal training in exercise physiology. So I went on to Baylor University and completed a PhD there in kinesiology and exercise nutrition. And it was really hard to find a program actually that married the exercise and nutrition side, even though we know these are both
Yeah.
interrelated and really important. So that was kind of a major factor there. And while I was there, I really fell in love with research. Up to that point, I had done some rodent research, but honestly, it made me think that I didn't like research because it wasn't that fun to me.
Yeah. Watching
But I
rats.
started, yes, yeah, the dissecting was a little more fun, but, pipetting clear liquids into tubes. And at that point, I didn't have the science understanding to know what I was really doing.
Yeah.
But when I started human research, I really loved it because it was so much more practical, and I could see how the results of our studies could directly inform people who are interested in the areas of, fitness and health. So there again, just fell in love with it. So after the PhD, I started a tenure track professor position out here at Texas Tech University, and I've now been out here, I guess, 8.5 years or so.
Nice.
So I run a research lab. Yes, it's hard. It's when I say it can that be right? But I think it is. I run a research lab here, so I have a team of students and collaborators, and we conduct a lot of work related to body composition. So essentially, how we measure it accurately, how we change it through lifestyle interventions, whether that's fasting programs like we may talk about, or other nutrition manipulations, exercise, and so on. I also now do some kind of consulting and other work just broadly in this field of body composition, sports nutrition, and so on. So that's
Nice.
kind of a meandering journey that's led me to this place I am now.
Nice. Love it. And then is your lab mainly focused, like continuing to focus on body composition over some of the other research topics that you've had over the years?
Yeah, I would say that's that's the broadest topic that we focus on. So we'll
Mhm.
look at that. I mean, the full spectrum, from looking at elite athletics and tactical populations like, firefighters or military, to clinical populations. We're doing more in the realm of obesity. Certainly lots of general population, recreational, recreationally active individuals. But so that's the main thing we study, but we definitely do quite a bit in the nutrition space and
Nice.
sports nutrition space as well.
Cool. I like it. All right. Well, we'll talk about all of that today. I kind of have questions on the side of the colloquial term intermittent fasting, and then as well as just learning about body composition measurement, because we all want to know how we can measure our progress. So let's start with the intermittent fasting, because that's a hot topic. I think we'll get some good attention there. Let's kind of define our terms, right? Because I know that there's scientific terms behind just intermittent fasting, and just getting a little bit more clear on those definitions, and then we can kind of break down the research behind it and how it actually works or doesn't work.
Yeah, so I love that you acknowledge that it is a broad term.
Yeah.
The reason I'm laughing is because we just in 2024 published an international consensus just on terminology of fasting. So
Mm,
just getting on the same page as researchers and clinicians of what are we even talking about with fasting. And it was
yeah.
published in 2024, but this was a several year process of about 40 fasting experts from around the world coming together and doing all these surveys and having these live conferences and just discussing all the terms, because up to this point it's really been the Wild West in the terminology. So that may not seem like it matters, but it makes it difficult when you're talking about something. Someone will hear intermittent fasting and they have a very specific definition in
Yeah.
mind. Others like yourself who are more versed in this area recognize, okay, this is kind of a broad paradigm and there are lots of ways someone could be following one of these programs. So yeah, I do have definitions in mind now that are informed by this consensus process. And it's interesting. I came in with my own preconceived notions. So last time we talked, some of my own views on this may have evolved since then,
Oh, okay.
because of this discussion with everyone. Um, but yeah, as you mentioned, intermittent fasting, and this is how we defined it, really is this broad paradigm involving any repetition of intentional abstention from food. But that's incredibly broad, and what most people typically are thinking of when they hear the term intermittent fasting is a form called time restricted eating. And I do think this is one of the most popular forms, and this is essentially when you consume all your calories within a given period of time each day. So commonly, and I'm sure many of the listeners would be familiar with this, very common is to implement something like an 8-hour eating window per 24 hours, with the remaining 16 hours being fasting, meaning that you're not consuming any calories during that time. So that's the most popular form, but there are a number of other forms that have been studied in the literature.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so yeah, just getting clear on that. And I think that's probably the primary one we're going to be talking about is time restricted eating. But I do have questions about maybe one other type. But can you kind of walk us through, though, with time restricted eating specifically, just some of the results and findings that you've had on just like the efficacy of that and also practical application?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. It's a fascinating area. As a little bit of background, I think some of the early work about a decade ago that really established this as an area that might be worth looking at. And say I'll talk about kind of specific to the United States mostly on this
Hmm.
data set, but there's some really nice data just trying to describe how we eat, what patterns we follow, because we have these kind of historical ideas like, oh, most people eat 3 meals a day and what have you. But when researchers looked at this in detail, if an alien were observing people in the United States and their eating patterns, they would not conclude from the data that most humans follow like 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
If you look at when people actually eat from the research, it's incredibly variable between individuals, even within individuals in some cases,
Hmm.
and kind of wild. If you plot all these points, there's no clear trend that emerges. That's like, oh yeah, most people eat breakfast here and lunch here and dinner here. So the frequency of eating is much higher than 3 meals a day. Many individuals are eating around the clock. The median fasting period is relatively short. If we're
Hmm.
defining fasting as abstention from all calories, whether this is from a beverage, from a little snack, what have you. So this is kind of what established this as an area to look at. It's like, okay, if people are kind of consuming calories, most people, from the time they wake till the time they go to bed, and it's very, kind of strange intervals. We've also seen that many people consume a large proportion of their calories later in the day.
Hmm.
Um, if we have something like an obesity epidemic and we know that we want to look for feasible strategies for individuals to reduce their calorie intake, or even in the fitness scenario, if we want an easy way to reduce calorie intake to hit some particular, body weight goal or body composition goal, seeing these trends in meal timing and frequency and distribution of calories kind of gave the rationale for why restricting that eating window And for many people, particularly cutting out maybe a few hours of eating towards the end of the day, say post dinner, that might be kind of low hanging fruit in terms of a way we could just adjust someone's eating schedule and lead to a calorie deficit. So kind of fast forwarding to the actual research to summarize a bunch of time restricted eating studies. There have been some great meta analyses, which are just combinations of the results of different studies, and some really rigorous clinical trials up to a year long, fairly highly
Mm.
controlled of time restricted
Wow.
eating. And collectively, all these lines of research show that time restricted eating can definitely be effective for reducing calories, reducing body weight, reducing body fat, improving health, as compared to someone's typical diet or
Mhm.
control diet, we could call it. However, if you put them on a program that had the same energy deficit, so you're
Mhm.
reducing calories by the same amount and similar nutrient intake, then there's really no benefit of time restricted eating beyond those other programs.
Yeah.
So that's summarizing many clinical studies for kind of a take home conclusion there.
I like the spark notes because that's kind of where I was going to take it next, right? Like, so compared to your average Joe not paying attention to their eating at all, if you just implement a time restricted window, you're more than likely going to lose weight, more than likely going to be in a caloric deficit or reduce your overall calorie intake, even if you're not in a deficit, and improve some health outcomes, is kind of the gist of that. But then as soon as we are tracking calories, hitting a calorie deficit, and comparing apples to apples there, the timing doesn't seem to matter as much. Am I gathering all that right?
Yep, absolutely. And
Yeah.
the one caveat I'll give is that all these results I'm talking about are at the group level. So,
Yeah.
there's certainly some individuals who maybe they already eat on a pretty shortened time period. Maybe they only eat over, 9 hours per day
Mhm.
naturally from the time they start eating to stop eating in terms of calories. So if you take them going from 9 hours to 8 hours, a common program, that's a really small stimulus. It might not even be detectable, maybe no change. Those who have seen the best results are those who tend to be the long eaters, where they have a very long eating window over
Mhm.
the day, meaning that restricting to something like an 8 hour eating window is quite a bit more of a stimulus for them.
Yeah.
So that's the caveat. And I'm sure you as a coach, appreciate the need for individualization.
Oh
But
yeah.
that's certainly true here, that we see these group level trends, but then, when you get down to the level of individual application, probably getting some information on someone's typical eating distribution and habits might kind of inform whether or not this would be a good strategy for them or not.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I think overall, like people's takeaways here can be like if I not if I want to shortcut it, but like if I'm really against tracking my food for whatever reason, maybe that's a viable strategy where I don't have to think so much. That could reduce my caloric intake. But there's not a guarantee because what if that's already how I'm eating, right? What if that's already super similar to the times that I eat versus being very, very different? So take into account your own context, situation, patterns. And so I always come back to like, we just need to have mindfulness and awareness over what we're currently doing so that we can know what the steps are to change it. But I want to take that a step further. So let's say we've got two groups that are, and I'm curious if there's like studies on this too, but even just your opinion, or if you had to like take a stab at it. If there's two groups and they are both in the same energy deficit, same kind of macronutrient compositions, all of that is equal, and one group is implementing a fasting period versus not, are there small 1% like sort of health outcomes or benefits from like kind of the word that I keep hearing is autophagy and like giving your body a break and that sort of thing? So is there merit to that argument?
Yeah. So my answer is kind of, and
Okay.
I'll explain. I'll explain why. If you were to look at all fasting research, so not just humans, but looking at cells and animals and humans, there's some pretty compelling research showing unique health benefits of fasting itself.
Okay.
Now, to date, the problem has been that we'll see, we might see this in cells, we'll see this in rodents, then we make to the jump to humans and it gets much muddier and it doesn't often hold up. And one of the reasons for that is that, it turns out, big surprise, humans are not the same as rodents.
Yeah.
But there's a specific reason here in the context of fasting, and it's because the metabolic rate of rodents is so different than humans. So we could put a rodent on a 12-hour eating period or an 8-hour eating period, and that's dramatically different than doing the same thing for a human. So, It varies some by, for example, the strain of mouse. But as an example, scaled based on metabolic rate, an overnight, like 12-hour fast in a rodent metabolically might be similar to a 3 or 4 day fast in a human.
Mm.
So what this means is the rodents are getting they're getting very deep into fasting, meaning they have some substantial physiological changes going, great differences in physiological pathways that are being stimulated or suppressed. Whereas in a human, it looks like, we probably have to get to 18, maybe 24 hours of fasting before those things start to happen.
Okay.
So point being, I do think there are actual unique physiological consequences and maybe even benefits of fasting in humans, but I think almost all the programs people follow aren't really getting into that fasting period.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not to say, oh, just fast longer. People should be fasting for days at a time. For some people, they might want to try that with appropriate, supervision and guidance and all of that.
Yeah.
But point being, I think that's one of the translational issues from some of the very promising work up to rodents, and then how it hasn't quite panned out in humans.
Okay.
Now, if we were to look at humans specifically, there are a few cases where we've seen maybe unique physiological benefits. Several of these are related to a form of time-restricted eating called early time-restricted eating.
Okay.
And this
That was
is
my
where
next place to
was that
go.
your next question?
Yeah.
So this is where you not only have, say a shortened window, maybe in, 6 or 8 hour eating window, but it's also earlier in the day. So you would eat breakfast and you would essentially eat until maybe mid-afternoon. And then from mid-afternoon on, you're not eating. And it's still preliminary, but there's some individual trials and even a couple meta-analyses showing possible benefits, particularly related to glucose regulation and insulin sensitivity with early time-restricted eating. Now, my gripe about early time-restricted eating is that it's great on paper, but I just don't know many people who, from a practical perspective, would be okay eating their last meal for the day at 3 p.m. So that means no dinner with a family, no dinner with friends, no happiness from 3 p.m. till you go to bed. I just don't see it personally translating at a group level. Again, you might have that individual who can do it and it's great for them. But I don't think it's like a solution or a great shortcut to better physiology for most people.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And then so I'm curious because I've kind of heard the term circadian eating a couple more times, I guess, in the past couple years when I'm looking at like really optimizing health and like just circadian rhythms as a whole. We've realized how important they are, I think, in overall coaching people and helping them with their health. So, what would you say? Is there merit to like kind of just how do I put this? Like front loading the bulk of your calories earlier in the day versus later. There's a study that like I cannot tell you the author, the year, anything, but I remember it being quoted where like one group ate big breakfast, moderate lunch, small dinner, and the other group did small breakfast, moderate lunch, big dinner, and the difference was the same amount of weight loss but a different amount of like symptoms experienced with like blood sugar regulation, cravings, things like that. So, like, is there merits to circadian eating in that regard, even if they are eating dinner, let's say in the evening?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think there are some merits similar to what we're talking about the eating windows. It is a little context dependent. So if you have someone eating, a large portion of their calories at dinner and say even like late at night, I think there are some benefits of shifting that. There are some other studies, kind of related to the one you mentioned, where they'll have the same people come into the lab multiple times, eat the same meal 2 different times, but one time is, say, in the morning and one is late at night. And late at night, we do see typically worse metabolic responses. So broadly, you could view this as your body not processing the nutrients as effectively. And that is related to circadian rhythms that you mentioned. So,
Yeah.
these natural times where we express more or less of particular proteins or certain processes in the body are more or less active. So yes, I think there certainly could be a good number of individuals that would benefit from shifting some calorie intake earlier in the day. And again, if you look at national data, most people tend to eat heavier later in the day. There are other implications here too, like protein. Your average person in the population is likely not consuming enough protein at breakfast.
Yeah.
If we go back to our 3 meals a day, which we know isn't entirely true, but
Yeah.
likely isn't eating enough at breakfast, maybe not enough at lunch, and then probably enough at dinner. So there are a number of individuals who might only be adequately stimulating muscle protein synthesis once during the day, like at one of the major meals. So that's another way where like shifting or maybe a more even distribution of protein throughout the day
Hmm.
could be beneficial for supporting health and body composition and so on. It's not super well established in tightly controlled studies, but I do think there's enough of a rationale there that if you're looking at your own diet or you're working with a client and you see it's like, okay, 40% of your calories are coming at dinner or later,
Yeah.
something like that, where you could definitely see how shifting some of that earlier in the day may be beneficial.
Okay. Yeah. Because I kind of, at least just from like a psychological standpoint, like saving all your calories for later tends to not go very well. So, like, I was wondering if the physiology kind of follows that as well, in terms of how those two obviously get married and then, the physiology and psychology impact each other too. So,
Yeah.
big time. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so. And I don't want to just put my own things on everyone else, but I also find, just at an anecdotal level, that the time I most want the foods that I least need in terms of being
mhm.
like nutrient poor, energy dense, all that, is typically later at the night. It's like after dinner. So for me, for example, like if I just say I'm not going to eat after dinner, it's not even necessarily that there's something magical about that period, though it is kind of a worse time, like we are talking about, to process nutrients. But it tends to eliminate some of the poor nutrition choices I make. So I love that you mentioned kind of that interaction of like physiology and psychology and just behavior, food choices, all of those factors, I think, can be
Yeah.
interrelated for some people.
Exactly, because it's like if you have a relationship with food where if you put that guardrail up, it just helps you abstain from excess calories at night. Awesome. But I also have people who, when they put that guardrail up, they feel restricted and they're more
Yeah.
likely to binge or overeat. So it's like you got to kind of know yourself and learn your patterns, but it can be a really helpful tool to have guardrails like that, or rules, quote unquote. Um,
Yeah.
Curious about, because I've heard this also recently too, and just diving more into women's health, I've really kind of just been fascinated by the differences between male and female physiology and how that might differ. So, what do you know about just fasting, time restricted eating, and its benefits or potential harms for women versus men? Is there any difference that you've been able to suss out at this point?
Yeah. This is such an interesting question because I feel like there's a lot of information out there that set, or a lot of recommendations, let's say, that something to the effect of, fasting programs might be okay in men, but women really shouldn't do them.
Hmm.
There were a few early studies in humans with a different form of intermittent fasting called alternate day fasting that showed that possibly it wasn't extreme, but showed maybe there were some worse metabolic responses in women. However, most of the research since that time hasn't supported that. And actually, most of the best studies of intermittent fasting, and by best I mean longest, most tightly controlled, most rigorous, most of them have used predominantly women, and a lot of these have come from Krista Verdi's lab at University of Illinois Chicago. They technically have mixed sex cohorts, but it's predominantly women, which is really interesting. And they've again and again showed for various forms of intermittent fasting, including time restricted eating, very favorable changes. Again, with calorie restriction, with weight loss, improving health markers, and so on. With the caveat that these are typically in a population that has obesity or
Okay.
overweight. So I think and there's less information here. We did one study in fairly highly resistance trained women and did not see any adverse effects on health, saw very good body composition improvements, muscular performance, and so on. But that's kind of a minor caveat that maybe as you get to leaner women and more highly active women, then we might get into more concerns, maybe both from, a possibly a disordered eating
Yeah.
perspective and also from energy availability overall.
Yeah.
If it's someone with a very high energy expenditure who's already potentially like restricting dietary intake, then I think you could probably see a scenario where fasting may be contraindicated.
Yeah.
But overall, the literature doesn't clearly support there being unique detriments of fasting in women as compared to men.
Very cool. Okay. Um, Curious about, because we were talking about the early time restricted eating window being favorable compared to late. Um, what's the mechanism behind that? Like, what makes that better in terms of like a hormonal response, in terms of a metabolic response? Like, why is that the case?
Yeah, so I'd say, and just to make sure I didn't misstate it earlier, some of the benefits that have been seen are health and independent of body composition or body weight. So I'm definitely,
Okay.
not saying that early time restricted eating with similar calories will lead to better body composition
Right.
changes. It's been more on, some of those physiological mechanisms. So, I mean, that my understanding of it and my perspective would be that this ties into the other great topic you brought up of circadian rhythms. And
Mhm.
this topic of chrononutrition is essentially the interaction of when and what we eat with these natural rhythms. So, for those who are interested in this, here's a brief, not tangent, but background. But we have a master clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus within our brain, that ultimately sets these patterns, these circadian patterns in the body. But we also have clocks out in our tissues. So like our muscles and our GI tract, pretty much most cells have these clocks, so to speak. And these clocks are influenced by things like the light we're exposed to. So this ties into other health related recommendations like
Oh, yeah.
avoiding blue light at night, and also when we eat and so on. But point being, we still have this master kind of timing in play. And in general, that favors more effective processing of nutrients earlier in the day. And this relates to all kinds of things. Some of it is like gastric emptying, how quickly food is actually emptied from your stomach, how quickly and effectively it moves through the intestines, the actual hormonal responses, like you're describing, related to insulin, the blood lipid responses, blood glucose responses, and so on. Those tend to be better, meaning that the nutrients are absorbed and cleared more quickly and effectively earlier in the day. Now, again, there's not an exact time where it's like, okay, if you're
Yeah.
before 7 p.m., it's good. If it's after 7 p.m., it's bad. This is kind of a continuous thing where we know like really late at night is worse than like mid morning. But as you get inch those two times closer and closer, I don't know that we can say like, okay, 5 p.m. is much superior to 8 p.m., for example. So some of those small things haven't been teased out, but as a general principle, we know very late night eating, probably not ideal, and mostly eating, of course, it depends on the time of the year and where you are, but kind of more during daylight for those of us who live in, I don't know, the
Not
middle of the earth
Alaska.
and not, yeah, exactly. um, those tend to be better times to eat.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think, as we get into the weeds of things, like I'm just kind of like nosy and fascinated. And I just want to know all the little details because, like, I will go to the extent of biohacking little details. But for a lot of practical application, it's let's eat at a schedule that works for you. If it helps you to cut off eating a little bit before bed, because then you're not going to be snacking, you're not going to be tempted to overeat when you're tired. It's probably a good kind of set in stone rule to have if it's not going to trigger anything disordered for you. And there could be benefits if you did eat a larger breakfast compared to all of your calories at dinner. So, like, general rules of thumb to take away in terms of what a lot of our clients are doing is just trying to set the basics. And so not overthinking these little details is important, but it's kind of nice to know. And like if you're at that level where you can dial it up, then you can experiment a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, some of these studies and some of what we're talking about is in the context of maybe like a mixed meal, a real meal, or overindulging. But there are also studies looking at, smaller nutrient intakes, sometimes a single nutrient like protein.
Mm,
My friend Mike Ormsby at Florida State has done a lot of great research on pre-sleep protein ingestion and looking at potential benefits for,
yeah.
protein balance overnight and into the next day. So, I mean, that can definitely be a good strategy if you're in the situation where someone is not able to get sufficient protein intake in by the time they're at dinner. They may need a post dinner feeding. And,
Yeah.
I'm certainly not saying if you're going to have, 150 or 200 calories worth of protein before bed, that's going to throw off your circadian physiology and cause problems. This is more in the context of, kind of like whole mixed meals and higher calorie meals. So, certainly a lot of nuance and individual application here.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely just want the listener to take away the fact that, like, if you do any sort of time restriction with your feeding window, or if you don't, if you eat the same caloric deficit, macronutrient composition as someone else who's doing the opposite, you will most likely see basically the same results in terms of weight loss outcomes, body composition outcomes. And there might be some 1% changes in terms of like how you are feeling or like quality of life related to like, does this fit with your schedule better? Does it help you stay on track more? And maybe some small physiological differences. But when you're comparing same calorie deficit to same calorie deficit, do not overthink this detail and just stick with your plan.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, because I get a lot of meal timing questions. So I'm just like, let me just make sure I say this because our clients listen to these podcasts.
Yeah, no, I think what you said is perfect. And, like you said, it's that individual level. Whenever we do a study by the end, kind of with exit interviews, some participants are saying, I can't believe how easy this is. This was so simple. And I love my results and so on. And other people are like, I hate this. I don't care what the results are. Like, I love eating
Never do
breakfast
this
and
again.
I hate it. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those individual level, preferences and even how they feel, like you were saying, how they feel. Some people feel better fasting a little
Mhm.
longer and some people feel terrible doing that.
Yeah, exactly. And then lastly, just making sure it's something that you can actually see yourself sticking to, right? Versus thinking,
Yeah.
I'm going to do this fasting thing for 8 weeks and then I'll be done. That's typically not the best approach. So,
Yep. Agreed.
sweet. Well, let's switch gears here. I want to ask about, kind of the bread and butter of what you guys are doing at your lab with body composition testing. So, this is something else I get a lot of questions about from clients. They've got their scale at home that measures their body fat percentage. They're like, how accurate is this? Or even like wearables and stuff nowadays do that. But let's talk about like how can people accurately measure and track their progress, and how reliable are these at home tools? And if they want to go deeper, like what are their options there?
Yeah. So, it's a big topic. So
Yeah.
even as a body composition researcher, I'll preface this with saying certainly no one has to use some method that's going to give them a percent body fat or fat-free mass fat. You don't have to track these metrics for these at-home devices we have, and we can talk about these. But often, by the time we're really confident that they're showing a change, by then you'll likely have noticed it in the
Yeah.
mirror with how your clothes fit, performance in the gym, what have you. So
Yeah.
by that point, it's probably just confirming something you already know. With these technologies, if it's an at-home body fat scale, if it's something that's circumference based, some type of equation, um, those small changes are very hard to track accurately, even in a laboratory. Even with all the techniques we have in our laboratory, small changes are very hard to interpret accurately, just because there's some natural error in the device itself and in our own bodies. So if anyone was assessing, let's say for an at-home body fat scale, something that could help you is following like very tight best practices, meaning you only assess after an overnight fast, after you've voided your bladder, in the same minimal clothing, just controlling everything you can, being incredibly particular about that. But even then, there's some variability due to things you've eaten in the last few days,
Yep.
um, that can affect your measurements and your hydration status, your electrolytes. All of these things can influence the measurement. So you certainly have to take any measurement with a grain of salt. If you are doing something like an at-home body fat scale, I'd say allowing enough time between assessments, and how much is enough time varies. If
Hmm.
you are, someone who assessed at the beginning of the program and you've been on a very aggressive calorie deficit, and say you are losing, I don't know, a pound a week or something like that, then after a few weeks, it may be reasonable to assess again. If you're someone
Hmm.
who's roughly weight stable and you're just trying to simultaneously lose a little bit of fat and gain a little bit of lean mass, that type of scenario is particularly difficult to track. So all that to say, you should always interpret any value you get with a grain of salt. You could even consider assessing 2 back-to-back days the same way and averaging those two values just to eliminate some of that variability on any given day.
Hmm.
And I'll pause there because I'm sure you probably have some perspectives or questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's pretty on par with just like taking it in with a grain of salt. And you took the words out of my mouth when you were like, a lot, enough time. How much time is enough time? Well, that depends. And like you said, context dependent. But usually, when we're looking at body fat percentage, body composition measurement changes, we can go into like the mechanisms by which these different devices work. But at the end of the day, if you're seeing your pants fit looser, if you're seeing yourself look tighter in the mirror, like trust that. And I think the biggest thing is these are tools to verify rather than things to live by and say, well, if the number there doesn't change, then like no matter what I'm seeing or I'm feeling isn't valid. That's a little backwards because we're then out of touch with our body. And so I think it's important to trust your body first, like tune into what you're feeling, and then use like these tools to kind of like boost your motivation or like continue to verify the progress that you're already seeing versus taking it at gospel. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. And I think having a few metrics can help. So, if you did something like, okay, I'm going to take a progress picture, whether that's for coach or just for yourself,
Yeah.
take a progress picture in a standardized way, take a body weight, knowing body weight is not everything, Maybe you
Same
have a body
idea
fat
there.
scale. You could also look at that, or a flexible tape measure. Say, I'm going to measure my waist circumference, my hip circumference, and even just those two. You could do more if you want. But if you have all those pieces of information, and you're also, like you said, aware of your body, how am I feeling in the gym? How do I feel like I've been adhering to whatever new nutrition program? Then you can get this collective, judgment of how things are going, without just being like, okay, wait, this one number went up from 25% to 26%. Instead, you could say like, okay, that did go up, but my body weight fluctuated a little bit. I know, what time of the month it is with my training and my nutrition and my physiology, and my waist circumference didn't change, and my strength went up in the gym. And you're kind of piecing together this collective idea of what's actually going on, saying like, all things considered, I think that small variation may not be a big deal. And as you continue to do that, you'll see there are some of those little, even if things are trending down or trending up, there's some of that up and down, between assessments that that you may not stress about as much if you're kind of trying to interpret everything holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the kind of greater topic that comes up a lot is just like the scale. And so like everything that Grant just said, say like take that with the scale as well, and how the scale fluctuates and how you can average it over time and look at trends, because just like he said, hydration status, where you're at in your cycle, can like really affect your body weight on a day-to-day basis. So try to standardize and look at trends. So with these tools, you got a lot of fun gadgets in your lab. I would
We
love to
do.
hear just kind of like give me like an ascending ladder of like what you found to be kind of like least accurate, in terms of like maybe we start with like the at-home tools or like the different kinds of methods, up to like what is our gold standard, and like if someone really wanted to like get as close as they could to knowing their body fat percentage, like where would they go?
Yes. So I will go with that ascending ladder. One caveat at the beginning is that we have kind of two components here. One is we can just call it the accuracy for simplicity, the actual accuracy of the device, meaning, and for those who are whatever science nerdy, validity is really what I'm
Mhm.
talking about here. But if we have someone as an at-home body fat scale, they step on, it says 25% body fat. If we're concerned with the validity, it's like, okay, how close is that 25% to our true body composition, which we would accept with as being the value from our best device, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
So that would kind of be the accuracy. But let's say, for the sake of argument, say your true body fat percentage is 25%, and say your scale at home says 30%. But say the scale you have at home is able to tell when it decreases or increases. So it can tell you
Mhm.
went from 30% to 27%. That still might be a useful tool if you can just say like, okay, I don't know if this 30% is real, but in tandem with everything else I'm tracking, I see that this has decreased from 30% to 27%. That matches with other data I'm getting with what I'm trying to do. Then this could be a useful tool for tracking over time. So that actually just change that delta value over time. So that's kind of caveat here when we talk about it. There's that component of some tools that might be useful, even though they're not technically the most valid for your actual number. They might be valid for assessing a change over time. So
Mhm.
I'll end that soapbox. But
Yeah,
if we
no.
were to start at the less accurate devices, it gets hard. We did a study on 15 different bioimpedance scales, and most of these were these at-home consumer scales. And I was honestly surprised by our results, because we saw some that were, frankly, terrible, like terribly inaccurate, worse than using nothing. But we saw some other ones that at the surface they looked very similar to the terrible scales, but they actually performed okay, not perfectly, but decently well. So this is just kind of a case of, it's hard to paint with broad strokes across technologies, even at home
Yeah.
body fat scales under $100. There are some that are decent and some that are very bad. So it's hard to make a broad determination. But if we had to for at home body fat scales, I would say, possibly useful as one data point, like we just talked about, in conjunction with a bunch of other things. I would not rely on them as your sole determinant about whether or not your program is effective or not.
Mhm.
In the same vein, circumferences, there are a lot of equations to predict body fat percentage from circumferences. If you do want to use circumferences, I would recommend not using one of those equations, but just picking a few relevant circumferences. So if you tend to gain and lose fat mass, for example, in your abdomen, tracking something like your waist circumference at your belly button could be really effective. If you tend to gain and lose it at your hips, tracking your hips at kind of the maximum circumference could be useful, or both of those. That'd be something where you don't have to know the percentage to be able to see like, okay, I'm at least measuring something about my body shape, which relates to body composition, beyond just stepping on the scale. So I think there can be a place for those circumferences or skin folds. Similarly, if you're able to assess your own skin folds or have a coach or friend or family member, someone you trust to do your skin folds, that can be another thing where you don't have to get a body fat percentage, but you can say like, okay, over time, I've seen that this subcutaneous fat thickness has increased or decreased at these certain body sites. So those would be kind of the lower level. Do you want me to pause there, or do you want me to just keep climbing the ladder?
So for the bioimpedance, as we go into like more methods that utilize that mechanism, like what is that exactly doing to measure? Because like circumference, obviously
Yeah.
you're using a tape and you're seeing the circumference, but what is bioimpedance for people?
Yeah. So bioimpedance injects small, imperceptible electrical currents into your body. And based off what the device knows it injected into your body, and then based on what it receives back at other electrodes that are in contact with your feet or your hands and your feet, kind of based on that difference, it can calculate how easily this current traveled through your body. And typically, tissues with a higher water content allow that current to travel more easily, while higher fat content will kind of impede that flow. So overall, based on how easily this current flows and this kind of circuit is completed, that information is used within a prediction equation to try to estimate really the amount of water in your body, and from that, your body composition. So this
Mhm.
is not direct. There are a few assumptions there, like, okay, we know that lean mass, and say skeletal muscle mass in particular, has more water content than fat mass. And because of that, we're going to estimate this for body fluids. And because
Yeah.
of that, we're going to estimate this for body composition. So it's not perfect. There's some jumps, but that's kind of the rationale of what's going on.
Yeah. And then with those, just because I know there's a lot of in bodies and things like that in gyms where people will assess their body composition pre or post workout, how susceptible is that to hydration status?
So incredibly, and yeah, if we're climbing up this ladder, in body, that would represent, say like an in body, 570, 770, 970, one of those that you might see in a gym or supplement store. Those are good devices. The issue is that you have to be really, everything I said about being kind of, very particular about how you prepare your own body before assessment. That's
Mhm.
just as true, if not more true, of these devices, because they're so sensitive. And that sensitive can be good in terms of detecting changes. But if you're just to step on randomly in the afternoon, especially after a workout, you'll
Mhm.
have all kinds of error. We've done studies on this, and I won't belabor it, but even things as simple as whether or not you consumed water in the morning after an overnight fast influences pretty substantially your results.
Yeah.
So if you can have access to that, you'd want to go in the morning, fasted, rested, following all those best practice items. And the trainers at the gym may not be telling you that. So you'd have to just kind of take it on yourself to say, okay, I know this is really important. Even if they say, oh no, you can just step on anytime. You have
Yeah.
to know that and assess only at a time when that's similar to every other time you've assessed.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely wanted to make sure to cover that because I got lots of people who are in group class environments where the
Yeah.
thing is right there and they do it after their workout and they're like, oh my God, I gained fat and lost muscle. And I'm like, hold on, hold on. So just wanted to make sure to clear that one, but go ahead, continue.
Yeah. So if we were looking at, a step up, and you kind of took that next rung perfectly, that if we're looking at a step up from these at-home devices, it would be something that might be present in, a gym, maybe some health clinics, maybe some supplement stores.
Yeah.
And these could be, something like an in-body. So that'd be like a multi-frequency bioimpedance device.
Hmm.
It could be something like a 3D scanner. I know here in town, some of our gyms have like a Fit 3D
Yeah.
3D scanner. There are phone-based 3D scanners, which I didn't mention at home, that are showing some promise. But these standalone 3D scanners might be, viewed as a step up. Really, if you're going higher than that, you're then talking about pretty much a research laboratory. So kind of similar to what we have here. And then you have a variety of techniques ranging from something like the bod pod, which is an air displacement test, to DEXA, which has gained quite a bit of popularity because of health conscious people with large followings kind of promoting DEXA scans. But DEXA is a very low dose X-ray technique that is an actual imaging technique. So you get an image of your body. You can look at different segments of your body, look at bone density, look at what we call lean soft tissue, so lean mass and fat mass. It's a very good technique. It's not perfect, but it is often viewed as kind of a reference technique or a standard that we could
Hmm.
compare to. If you're in a lab like mine, where this is really what we do, our best models are actually combining multiple different tests together. And we kind of pull the strongest features from each of these devices and put them into this complex validated equation that will view the body kind of in a more complex, nuanced way than any individual technique can. So
Mm-hmm.
again, it's not, these are called multi-compartment models, but not something most people have access to outside of a research setting.
Yeah.
And kind of other techniques up at that level would be something like magnetic resonance imaging. If you could get a whole body MRI done, which is not
Wow.
particularly common,
Yeah.
then you could really look at truly skeletal muscle mass, adipose tissue, all of this in 3 dimensions, which is very cool.
Yeah. Where is hydrostatic weighing on that list?
Hydrostatic weighing would be pretty similar to bod pod. So they
Okay.
actually operate on an identical principle. Bod pod is just air displacement, whereas hydrostatic weighing is water displacement.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both good techniques for getting overall body density. Just to go from body density to body composition, there are several assumptions involved. So it's a decent technique, maybe on par with something like the better in bodies, but certainly not perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate you breaking it down though, because I think I just get a lot of questions about my body fat percentage. What is it? How do I know if it's the right number? Compared that to BMI, and we're in this whole weeds of a conversation. But I think the takeaway you gave at the beginning is really important. Is let's make sure we're measuring our progress and trends over time. Let's look at how our actual body is measuring and feeling versus just relying on these numbers. And I think it helps to just kind of debunk a little bit about each of these machines and things. Cause like from personal experience, I don't know if you remember, but when we first connected, I was working part-time in a lab at my university, and I would administer bod pods to people, which means I would definitely jump in it here and there and just see like what came up on a certain day. And I was super just like testing myself for like every reason that I could. And I did that, and then I went and got a DEXA in the same conditions at the same time, like within the same week basically, and the numbers I got were completely different. I think I got
Okay.
a 26% on a bod pod and like a 23% on a DEXA, and like it was just like, okay, so like we really don't know what that number is, and that's okay. Like, are we seeing progress in the direction that we want to see it in how we look and how we feel? So that's really the big takeaway I want people to take from this, and hopefully just know a little bit more about some of these devices so they're not just tossing their money out for these numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you do have access to a better device and you can test in standardized conditions, I think it could be great to have periodically.
Oh yeah.
I personally like to get testing around like my annual physical when I have blood work and other health markers to kind of tie it to. And I think
Yeah.
tracking all that over time is very helpful. But if you don't have access to any of that and you just have like at home devices or nothing, it'd be perfectly reasonable to choose not to assess those things. If it feels like a net detriment to you to be
Yeah.
stressed about this body fat percentage the same way you might be stressed about body mass, then there's nothing to say you need to. But if you like that data point and you can interpret it holistically, then I think that might be where you can, like you said, look for some of those trends over time, take it with a grain of salt, but just kind of use it as one piece of the puzzle of what is going on with your body at a given point in time.
Exactly. And it's like, who better to hear that from than the person whose literal living depends on researching with these devices? So it's like, if that doesn't debunk it, I don't know what does.
Well, thank you. Yeah, sometimes it's funny to be like, yeah, this is the main area of my lab, but also you don't need to assess this if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Of course. So I want to kind of know, just looking ahead, is there, if you can talk about it, are you working on anything new, or like what research are you like looking to kind of break into next?
Yeah, so I've been doing, I'm definitely by origin a lifestyle guy on nutrition and exercise and all this, but I'm doing more in the obesity space, and it's really fascinating. The landscape has evolved so much with some of these GLP-1 pharmaceuticals. So,
Yeah.
when we're talking about tracking small changes, these are like the opposite end, where we're seeing very large changes in body composition and a lot of questions that have arisen about fat mass changes and lean mass changes and muscle changes. So, I'm increasingly involved in that area, and it's really very interesting to see. And I think it's to me, it's supportive of all the things we know that are important in lifestyle, where we know these best practices for body composition with resistance training and certain dietary intake and protein targets and all this can support optimal change. But that's kind of an area that I've been increasingly involved in. On the technological side, we're about to get a really cool device called a peripheral quantitative computed tomographer.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's PQCT. It's essentially a CT scanner, which is very similar to MRI, but this can look at the limbs. We'll be able to look at lots of detail on like muscle architecture and the amount of fat in the muscle and the size of the muscle and all of this. So kind of on the research lab side up here, my colleague and I are very excited to get this device in because it will kind of expand what we can do in our normal research line. So those are a couple of the areas, but honestly, there's always a bunch of projects going on. It's all super fun stuff. I feel, fortunate to be studying things in areas where people like yourself are interested in chatting about them.
Definitely. Well, I will definitely have to book you out a few months in advance for another one then on, GLP-1s in the obesity realm. Like that's just a super hot topic right now. So I'd love to be able to
Yes.
pick your brain on that. So sweet.
Yeah.
Well, where can our audience keep up with this research and what you're doing in your lab, and where can they find you?
Yeah. So online, I'm probably mostly active on Instagram, and my handle there is just Grant_Tinsley_PhD. So I'll post about research in our lab and projects I'm working on, and sometimes my home gym and things like that. And then I do have a personal website that has some more information about my team and stuff I'm involved in, and that's just my name. So granttinsley.com.
Perfect. We'll put it all in the show notes so you guys can follow him there. But thank you so much for just letting me pick your brain, be curious, and really debunking a lot for our clients and our audience. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure talking to you.